This program brought to you by the generous support of the Connecticut Health Foundation, dedicated to improving the health of the people of Connecticut, Toyota Financial Services, the William Casper Graustein Memorial Fund, and Families United for Children's Mental Health.
In the pictures, they look like any other happy kid, caught up in the wonders of childhood. But beneath the surface,
he was just running up and down our block at 3 o'clock in the morning, and he didn't sleep for 3 nights.
Beneath the surface, something is terribly wrong.
She thought there were foxes under her bed that were going to chew her up.
He picked up a knife and attempted to defend himself, stood there in the kitchen and put a knife to himself, to his throat.
Still, as a parent, you never want to give your child that diagnosis, mental illness, that you're in denial. There's no way.
Who suffers from mental illness? They're the kid from the troubled home, but they're also the state free throw champ and the bubbly cheerleader turned beauty queen.
I had a period of time where I was hurting myself.
1 out of every 5 kids has some form of mental illness. Chances are there's someone you know.
Until you actually live with a child that's having these difficulties, it's almost like you speak a different language and no one can understand.
For the sickest kids, a world filled with emergency room visits, managing medications.
She was on Trileptal, she was on Lexapro, she was on Wellbutrin, she was on Depakote. It's frightening.
And run-ins with the law.
My heart pounds when I hear a police siren.
Parents and kids in crisis up against a system in shambles. I'm Christina DeFranco, and this is a special presentation on a crisis within our healthcare system. Children with mental illness have become society's most vulnerable medical patients, forced to cope with a fragmented system that hurts kids and the families who love them. And whether or not you know a child with mental illness, this crisis is probably impacting you, from how much you pay for health care to how long you wait in an emergency room. But first, the children. Throughout the next hour, you'll get to know 5 teenagers and their families who've suffered yet shown tremendous courage facing a system that's stacked against them. 17-year-old Amanda Kemp's bedroom, a shrine to a high-achieving teenager.
This is the one I play most often, probably. I love it.
But the trappings of perfection belie her battle with bipolar disorder, which literally knocked her off her feet freshman year at Trumbull High.
It's kind of like you're in a zone and everything just doesn't feel right. You feel like you're not worth being there. And it hurts. It hurts yourself and you just want to cry and you don't want to function. You can't function. Some days I couldn't brush my teeth. Everything just felt too much.
They were so extreme, from the happy, very motivated honor student to the daughter who wasn't talking, the change of clothing, the dark, the black. She became very antisocial, very sad, spent a lot of time in her bed crying.
That first year of high school, Amanda missed 41 days.
There's a lot of times where I just couldn't handle it. I just ended up staying out of class. I'd go to the parking lot, sit there for hours. I'd be in the nurse's office. I'd be going home. I wouldn't be going to school. I had a real hard time functioning. A lot of the time I was anxious, I was nervous. What do I do now that my faith and sanity have gone? Where do I begin? Where do I belong? I'm so lost inside this head of mine, so scared but not afraid to die. Writing really helped me. It was something that I could express who I was. I could write anything I wanted down on that piece of paper, and I could just close it and it'd be over. And that felt really good for me. My heart is aching, but I cannot cry. My mind is lost. I'm disgusted inside. I look in the mirror. I see someone else. I search for my being, but I refuse all help. God, please grant me a break from my life. Maybe in heaven, that would be nice. But Mom is searching for the cure in a book.
Amanda's mother had no idea what was happening to her preppy daughter. Desperate for answers, Karen started searching those journals for clues.
And I needed to know what was going on in her head. And so once I read some things that were frightening to me, I asked her doctor to please put her in the hospital.
And I was hyper, and I could stay up forever, and I wouldn't be tired. And then I'd be so viciously mad, though, all the time, and then I'd crash, and then I'd be depressed again. And it's just like a whirlwind of a dark hole. You're just a mess, and you have no outlet to anything.
Mood disorder, bipolar, same thing, and that was in Silver Hill Hospital. I had to try to let myself believe this is the mental health issue your daughter has.
The diagnosis, just the beginning of a 3-year nightmare through multiple doctors and therapists, pills and prescriptions.
As she was trying different drugs, some of the side effects were horrible on her, but I knew that she needed it. A lot of the drugs, yes, are not approved for children, but they continue to experiment with them. Unfortunately, you have to make that decision. Do you want to experiment with your child? We were desperate.
A lot of the medications really impacted me physically, like making me sick or making me feel worse mentally. It just was a whirlwind of craziness.
So really, every time there was a medication change, I journaled it. I mean, it shows you how many different medicines. Zoloft she was on Trileptal, she was on Lexapro, she was on Wellbutrin, she was on Depakote, all with negative effects to her, so very frustrating to her. She got sick a lot, which made her even more frustrated. Upper respiratory chest infections, a lot of weight gain, aggression, and then there was feeling mentally better, but still too anxious. Pages and pages and pages. Sometimes she had twitches at night. I would go up and check on her when she tried a new medication.
It was never 1, and it was never 3, or it was never 2. It was all different mixes, and then they didn't work, or they made it worse and made it better at the same time. And it was just hard, and it was tiring.
The Kemps are not alone in their odyssey to find the right medication for Amanda. Countless studies report a dramatic increase in the use of so-called psychotropic medication for children and adolescents in the past decade. They also state that research has lagged behind the surge in their use. As a result, many of these drugs have not been approved for children by the Food and Drug Administration. So parents, like the Kemps, go with their gut.
And you question everybody. You question yourself, you question the doctor. You feel really desperate.
You have to educate them about what's been studied about the medicine.
Dr. Lisa Namerow, a child psychiatrist at Institute of Living for more than a decade. She's written thousands of prescriptions.
There is a difference between a medication being FDA labeled and approved for children and whether or not a medication's been actually studied in children. I would never write a prescription for a medication that doesn't have data to support its safety or efficacy in children in one of those kinds of journals. I would, however, write a prescription for a medication that doesn't have FDA label if I've seen in the studies that it's been helpful.
While it's unnerving for parents to make choices about medication without the confidence of FDA approval, there's been substantial progress in research on psychotropic drugs for kids, a result of a federal law passed in 2001 that gives incentives to pharmaceutical companies conducting clinical trials for children.
So the term guinea pig ends up being used a lot in psychiatry. Family says, I don't want to be a guinea pig. Is this studied in children? Or do you think this is going to work? But really there are other medical illnesses where that same sort of trial and error is what is the process that you have to go through.
Today's Friday. So that's for tomorrow morning.
3 years later, the Kemps finally got it right.
I'm getting stable as I'm getting older, so hopefully I'll be able to function without medication. But if I'm not going to be able to, then I'm going to stay on it, because I don't want to go through what I went through again. I'm happy now.
And I just wrote doing great, and that's the happiest note I have in this book.
This is what Ken and Lolly Ross hope will keep their bipolar son Parker out of jail.
He was at his darkest about a year ago. I would say suicidal. Right now, he's full of confidence.
Parker, move. Use your footwork, Parker.
The boxing keeps me busy, very busy. I run every day, work out, you get a job and everything, and he'll be so, busy with all this stuff, and he won't have time to really, do any drugs or get into fights.
Boxing as therapy, a way to stabilize Parker's violent outburst after years of living in crisis.
When Parker was home and we were having so many problems, every time the phone rang, I would just jump out of my skin. I didn't know if he was arrested or if he killed himself. I had no idea, and we were living on the edge. We were really living on the edge.
I always wanted to get in a fight and stuff, and I always was really hyper and, disrespectful to people.
And he was suicidal when he was 7 and 8. But his first major psychotic break was in 7th grade. We didn't know what was happening. He was up all night. We went to the hospital for help, and they basically said, well, give him some sleeping pills or give him, and there was no psychiatrist on duty. And we brought him home. We weren't going to leave him sitting in the emergency room. And we basically stripped down our house here and locked everything sharp in the trunk of our car.
At just about every turn, the Ross family says their cries for help were ignored.
In-home support we had received was very sporadic. The people didn't show up half the time. We'd corral Parker, get him home, and they wouldn't come. It's really important to keep a record of everything, I found out.
These are Parker's records from the Greenwich school system.
He'll get counseling 2 to 3 times a week. Most of his classes will be very small, 5 or 6 kids in a class.
But as Parker got older and more out of control, his life started to fall apart.
Got in fights in school because he was not supervised. He would wander off the school grounds. We would get calls. We don't know where Parker is.
Just hanging out with the wrong people, getting in trouble and stuff. And it didn't help me a lot.
He still was arrested right on school grounds 3 times. So it sent him from that schoolhouse to jailhouse, track.
There's been other situations where I wasn't thinking at all, like taking 32 pills of some cough medicine, which almost killed me.
He almost killed himself. He was almost successfully completed suicide.
After the hospitalization, Parker was sent to Kids Peace, a residential treatment center 150 miles from the Ross's Greenwich home. The local schools could no longer educate him, and Lolly Ross says her family didn't get the adequate support services from the Department of Children and Families, which oversees children's mental health in Connecticut.
We really don't want any family to have to go through what we've been through, especially parents who can't speak up. We were able to speak up, and it's still, we watched this unravel right in front of us, and we knew we were caught in this tornado of systems that were unresponsive.
It was unbearable for us. We weren't allowed to visit him. We can only make 1 phone call a week, and 9 out of 10 times he wasn't available. And I couldn't think, I couldn't sleep. But it was here. It was just a stress. I got to the point last Thanksgiving where I literally walked myself into Stanford Hospital to check myself in.
Ken Ross ultimately found his peace in the boxing ring.
I was addicted in the first week of boxing, and I haven't stopped since that time.
During the 15 months that Parker lived at Kids Peace, his dad sweated out his stress at Soleil. He even went on to win the world championship belt in his age and weight class.
As soon as I took up boxing, I knew this was Parker's thing. I knew it. Parker's extremely athletic, he has tons of energy, and he can focus. When he really puts his mind to something, he can totally focus.
So when Parker finally came home from Kids Peace in June, his dad brought him to the gym.
You're working your butt off. You know, you don't want to fight after you fight, because you go in the gym and fight, and it's fun. And you're friends with everyone there. It tires you out.
The Rosses knew they'd need more than boxing workouts to continue Parker's progress at Kids Peace. So they enlisted in the Department of Children and Families Voluntary Services Program to try to get him counseling and a job.
It's like a second career advocating for his needs.
Jab, right hook, left body punch. Nice and easy.
Bipolar disorder. By far the most daunting opponent Parker will ever face. And his parents say the longer he waits for those critical services, the less likely his chances of survival.
There you go.
And did you read your second book for school this year?
Not yet, no.
Not yet?
I keep forgetting. I don't know how.
Jeffrey, it's Friday. When do you go to school?
Thursday.
You have less than a week.
This has been 17-year-old Jeffrey Salvatore's home away from home for the past year.
Do I have to take you to the store and buy the book with you?
Priscilla Peabody, his surrogate mother in what's called a therapeutic foster home. Jeffrey's parents chose this unorthodox treatment through the Department of Children and Families Voluntary Services Program.
I can't even begin to explain how awful knowing that Jeffrey needed to go away for a while felt to my husband and I and the whole family.
After one suicide attempt, 6 hospitalizations, and a string of failed programs, Dana Marie Salvatore felt this was the only option for her bipolar son.
He was headed to residential, and because of his age, most likely it would have been out of state, very far away, and that, as a family to us, was not an option.
That's where Beanie, as she's called, stepped in. A licensed therapeutic mentor, she lives in New London, just 20 minutes from the Salvatore's home.
I have been mentoring him for a long time, so we were already friends, and so I knew what he liked, I knew what he didn't like.
So I want to stay out of hospital. That's my #1 goal. Just to stay away from just any kind of residential thing, any kind of hospital.
Living here has accomplished that goal. Jeffrey gets one-on-one attention from Beanie. At home, he had to compete with his younger sister and brothers. Difficult for a demanding teen with complex needs.
I change all of a sudden. It just happens. I cycle, I just change. I get really hyper, real hyper. And I get just really upset easily, really easily.
When Jeffrey was at his sickest, he had to stop playing basketball, even though he was once the state free throw champ in his age group. He says he lost friends and felt very alone.
Just being sick, it just brought me down, made me just get a lot more competitive, and just like losing and maybe just really get really upset. But just playing basketball, playing sports made me get really upset, and I just couldn't handle it emotionally.
It took Dana Marie Salvatore 4 years to find this unique arrangement for her oldest son. 4 years of frustration, 4 years of failure.
We had been engaged with every service offered under the sun, and yet it wasn't meeting Jeffrey's needs anymore. Do you think, could she call me back?
In her darkest hour, Dana Marie remembers making 18 phone calls before finding a family support group. She's determined to prevent other families from experiencing that agony and has become an advocate for parents who have children with mental illness.
I think families easily identify that they need things like respite. Every day, there's some small way that I can leverage the system and reach out to another family that was in the situation that we were in. It helped me gain power over something that felt so powerless.
While she works for change on a grassroots level, Connecticut's former Lieutenant Governor Kevin Sullivan fights to change policy and public opinion statewide. In 2004, he held hearings across the state to identify gaps in the mental health system.
From a financial standpoint, a care standpoint, a humane standpoint, I'm just persuaded that this is a place where we can make a huge difference if we would just see it as being as important as all the other health issues that we deal with.
Like Dana Marie Salvatore, personal experience drives his passion.
There is in my life someone I care very much about. There has been in my life somebody I care very much about who's dealt with this.
While he won't disclose any more about this, the emotional impact is obvious.
You've got to do prevention, you've got to do awareness, you've got to do counseling, and you've got to provide the resources in the communities.
Those community resources were promised back in the 90s when Connecticut closed its state mental hospitals that primarily warehoused patients. But Sullivan says the savings were never channeled back into the system for additional services. And that's why today, the mentally ill wind up in nursing homes, homeless shelters, prison, and on the street.
And we are still relying on sort of the same failed approaches, rather than understanding the best place to deal with mental health is soon, not later. The best time, the best place is in the community, not in a hospital, not in an emergency, not in a prison after it's too late.
The fact is, many advocates say Connecticut's doing a better job than most, and that progress starts here in the legislature. In the past budget round, the state pumped an additional $37 million into mental health services over the next 2 years, a result of the Lieutenant Governor's initiative. But many in the mental health arena would agree there is still a lot of work to be done.
The children's system has not kept up at all with the adult system.
Jeannie Milstein is Connecticut's child advocate. Her mission, to make sure kids are being protected and taken care of. When it comes to children's mental health, she says, that's not always happening.
We don't have enough home and community-based supports for children. So what happens is children might be in a psychiatric facility or a residential treatment facility or an emergency room for acute care, and there's no place for these children to go. These kids need to have appropriate supports and services so that they can get out of these institutions and either go back and live successfully in their own homes, or live successfully in foster care, or live successfully in a smaller kind of group home.
The Department of Children and Families is shifting more resources into community-based care, spending roughly 60% more now than it did 3 years ago. DCF now has the ability to provide in-home services for 2,000 kids. This didn't exist 2 years ago. The agency is under court order to move kids in its custody out of residential treatment centers, kids who could better be served in smaller settings.
We're using less out-of-state residential service. Most of the out-of-state care we're doing now is in Massachusetts.
In the past year and a half, there's been a 25% decrease in the number of kids in state custody living in residential treatment centers. To accommodate the number of kids coming back into communities, DCF is building 50 group homes, smaller settings that serve 5 kids per home. But none of this is moving fast enough for Jeannie Milstein and the children in crisis now.
Friday afternoons in my office, we get the calls from the hospital. A 6-year-old is here. There's no place to put this child. We can't leave a 6-year-old in an emergency room over the weekend. Think about what an urban hospital emergency room is going to be dealing with that weekend. And we're going to have a 6-year-old exposed to that?
But that's exactly what's happening. And it's happening at an alarming rate.
We've seen the numbers of children in acute psychiatric distress requiring assessment and treatment increase at an almost exponential rate. We are not a psychiatric facility and are not licensed to be one.
At Connecticut Children's Medical Center's emergency department, there were 480 of these cases in 1998. 7 years later, in 2005, that number more than tripled to 1,659. What's even more startling, how long some of these young patients are stuck in the emergency department waiting for placement.
We've been forced to issue the warning that because our emergency department is not a safe or a therapeutic place for children, an acute psychiatric crisis, that we are fearful that a child will die here.
In 2001, when Connecticut Children started tracking the number of nights young psychiatric patients slept in the emergency department, 139 patients spent 222 nights there. Just 4 years later, in 2005, those numbers rocketed to 750 patients, spending a total of 1,074 nights, roughly 5 times as many kids spending 5 times as many nights.
This is not a therapeutic environment for these children, and we know that a child in acute psychiatric distress who is in a setting that is wildly stimulating, which an emergency department is, unpredictable, loud, filled with light 24 hours a day, noises coming in from loudspeakers and from the hallways. Not only is this not therapeutic, but these types of additional stresses may certainly contribute to a child's further deterioration. Seeing children who remain here stuck because there's no place for them to go for 3, 5, 7, 9 days at a time is demoralizing at best.
But Dr. Dworkin says he and his staff must cope. He's designated rooms at the back of the emergency department for psychiatric cases.
We have stripped them of medical equipment that could pose a potential danger to these patients. As you can see, if you look around the walls, it's pretty bare. We've committed staff to oversee the care of children in these rooms. And again, we've brought in mental health professionals through our relationship with the Institute of Living to do their very best in tending to the immediate acute needs of these children.
There's a 24-hour watch on these children to keep them safe.
Our need to commit staff has had an impact on general staffing of our emergency department. The flow of patients through the general emergency department is impacted. Our waiting times have increased.
It's not just happening here. It's happening at Connecticut's other children's hospital, Yale New Haven, and emergency rooms all over the state. Gridlock, because there are not enough hospital beds or services to meet demand.
We have many children who stay far longer in inpatient beds than would be necessary according really to their clinical needs, and who are there because we can't move them on.
Dr. Harold Schwartz is the chief psychiatrist at Institute of Living, one of the first mental health hospitals in the United States and Connecticut's oldest hospital.
We're looking at the back here of the original 1822 building.
The campus was designed by the legendary landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted, who himself suffered from mental illness late in his life.
This area, Central Green, was part of the Olmsted design. Much of it's been lost.
The Institute of Living provides extensive psychiatric, addiction, and behavioral health services to children, teens, and adults. But Dr. Schwartz says the current system makes it almost impossible to do business.
We are barely, and usually not even barely, reimbursed the total cost for a day's care in a child and adolescent inpatient bed. That we have to contract with managed care companies that are trying to drive the costs down is a very significant part of that problem.
And when you consider that many of these patients must stay longer at the hospital because of the shortage of services in the community, you begin to understand why the crisis backs up into emergency rooms.
And as the burden increases, as the kids pile up in the emergency room, and you're trying to get them into inpatient beds, and there are fewer and fewer of them, and then you're trying to move them from the inpatient beds that they're in a reasonable time out to the next level of care, but the system in the community for the next level of care is wholly inadequate, and so kids who really ought to be in the hospital for no more than 10 or 15 days wind up in hospital for 30 or 40 or 50 or sometimes longer days. The situation becomes quite impossible.
Impossible for doctors who provide the highest levels of care.
These are our waiting lists of folks trying to get appointments.
Impossible for doctors in the community.
Right now, we have a waiting list as long as 6 months.
Dr. Deborah Kustrin runs Community Mental Health Affiliates, one of the state's 26 guidance clinics that offer a wide range of therapeutic and counseling services to families and kids. First stop for many who are looking for help.
To make the phone call, to take that step, and then to be told, I'm sorry, we can't see you, we're going to put you on a waiting list, is probably pretty devastating for some families. And you hope that nothing serious happens between the time the family calls and the time the family does see you.
If something serious does happen, well, you can guess where the child ends up.
We are at a desperate shortage of qualified clinicians, of psychiatrists, of psychologists, of mental health workers. Finding qualified individuals to do this work is very hard.
It took Dr. Kustrin 5 months to hire a psychologist, and many times the clinicians she hires don't have much experience because the pay is so low.
We have been understaffed from the time that I've been here. I've worked at other agencies where we're always understaffed.
And underpaid. Part of the problem with funding levels for these clinics, and for most mental health professionals, insurance and Medicaid only pay out for time spent with the actual patient.
Our reimbursement gets whittled down by denials of payment by managed care organizations.
Thirteen-year-old Emily Nelson's mental illness took her mother on an agonizing journey through the pitfalls of managed care.
I was sitting there stunned, stunned at the system and the helplessness of doctors and physicians and psychiatrists who are educated, powerlessness against an insurance company who is somewhere miles away, who has not ever met my daughter, and the only thing they know is that I'm draining money from their financial till.
To fully appreciate Ann Nelson's exasperation with her health insurer, you need to understand her anguish as a parent, forced to accept a shocking diagnosis before Emily even made it to 2nd grade.
When we first put her on Ritalin, it was awful. I grieve the fact that I have the only 4-year-old child in the shoreline of Connecticut on Ritalin. And I think with each med, there's a new diagnosis. So, you start off with Ritalin and, oh, well, I have a kid with ADHD. So, okay, I guess I can deal with having a child with that. And then it's depression. You think, gosh, geez, I don't think I know anybody who ever had a child with depression, or did my mother have depression? You start to sort of look back and not only who is your child, but who are you and who is your family. And then I think the worst thing, which was a horrible grief for me, was when it escalates to maybe it's bipolar disorder.
And that was the diagnosis, bipolar disorder, at age 7.
And it was awful. It was absolutely awful because, yeah, there's meds, there's choices, but I think the hardest thing for me was I have a mentally ill child,
Ann is a nurse, her husband Kelly a doctor. They bought the best insurance coverage money could buy.
I pay a business $1,200, $1,500 a month to receive a service, which is the best psychiatric care for my daughter. That's what I was told on their contract. You will get inpatient hospitalization.
But in her time of crisis, a Sunday night when Emily started to hallucinate and was rushed to the emergency room, her daughter was denied coverage for inpatient hospitalization, even though doctors fought to admit her.
And they said, your insurance company just called back and they're not going to cover her admission to St. Raphael's. And I said, well, why is that? And they said, they don't believe it's medically necessary and she doesn't meet the clinical criteria.
At this stage of Emily's illness, she'd already been hospitalized twice for psychotic breakdowns, and she was on multiple medications.
And I said, well, all right, if they don't give the authorization number, I said, I'm not rich, but I can write you a check. We're blessed in that at least we have some money in the bank. Can I write you a check for $10,000 or $20,000? Whatever it takes to get my daughter tucked into a bed tonight on a Sunday night so that we can deal with this issue tomorrow. It's Monday. No, we can't do that. And I said, so you mean to tell me that the only ticket to getting Emily a bed in an appropriate child psychiatric hospital in this state is some 5-digit number from Value Options? They said, absolutely, that's what it is.
Denied and desperate, Ann turned to the Department of Children and Families Voluntary Services Program.
This hospitalization, which was about $50,000, our state of Connecticut paid that bill. My insurance company did not. When you're talking about a family like ours sucking money out of our state to pay for a child, I find it sick. I find it absolutely sick.
Ann's daughter was denied care capriciously.
Maureen Smith is Connecticut's healthcare advocate. Every formal complaint about health insurance and managed care comes across her desk. The highest percentage of those complaints involves mental health.
We've been trending these issues for 3 or 4 years now, and it is getting worse as time goes on. I get the stories of my child's been in an emergency room for 5 days. She has tried to commit suicide. The hospital doesn't have a mental health unit, and so we're waiting for a bed to open up.
Smith gets the calls about the shortage of mental health providers, therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists.
Patients are calling and saying, I called 10 people in my area that are in the directory, and all of them have dropped out.
She also hears from providers who complain about the insurers.
We've had it. Our reimbursement rates are low. We have more than enough paperwork that overwhelms us. We get micromanaged.
Some even drop out, refusing to take insurance and requiring patients to pay out of pocket. But her top priority is denial of coverage, like in the case of Emily Nelson.
I would describe it as being in a state of crisis.
A crisis so severe that Connecticut's Attorney General Richard Blumenthal is investigating.
We have encountered repeatedly examples of children being denied medical care to their very severe and lasting detriment. We're going through those records, the computerized records that are kept by our Department of Social Services, to determine whether the private insurers are refusing to pay for medical treatment and thereby shifting the costs to our state government and our taxpayers, which would be a violation of their contracts and the public trust. The cost potentially is in the tens of millions of dollars, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars. Whatever the precise figure, it is a huge issue financially and in human terms.
You know, I couldn't disagree with that more.
Lobbyist Keith Stover represents every insurance company in the state except Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield. He's the closest we could get to the insurance industry, and he's frustrated with the Attorney General's accusations.
The frustration you hear from me is very simply people making a broad pronouncement that the industry is shifting costs to the state and it's potentially costing the state tens of millions of dollars without any data to back that up. That's nonsense. It's not fair and it's not accurate. It would probably cost more to develop a scheme like that and implement it than it would to pay for care. You know, I mean, that's silly.
It's a strategy known to Blumenthal as cost shifting, and he and child advocate Jeannie Milstein take it very seriously.
The rules that can be enforced here could apply not only civil remedies with recoveries of money, but also possibly criminal sanctions, because if there is purposeful and intentional cost shifting by these agencies, it could be a fraud on the federal or state governments.
Blumenthal was instrumental in changing Connecticut's mental health laws, which required insurers to provide the same level of coverage and the same co-payments for mental illness as they do for physical illness.
It is a very expensive area. Payers have experienced a significant increase in the amount of money that they're paying for mental health care services since the passage of that law.
But as Ann Nelson experienced, and Maureen Smith hears all the time, Managed care companies make the final call on whether a patient's symptoms qualify them for coverage.
The symptoms are so vague. Yells at mother, hits sister, runs away from school bus. I mean, they can argue that those aren't medical symptoms.
The thing that makes it more challenging on the mental health side is that diabetes is much easier to identify. You can draw blood tests, you can see results. With bipolar, it's not that clear and it's not that distinct.
A psychiatric disorder is more mysterious and mystifying, perhaps harder to understand, because it is not a sort of physically visible malady. Its effects may be physically visible, but the disorder or dysfunction is perhaps more difficult to diagnose in layman's terms. So the cost shifting may be more easily explicable by the insurer, or the denial of treatment may be harder to hold an insurer accountable.
Translation, there's a lot of gray area. Stover says that's where mental health providers take the blame.
And frankly, that provider community needs to get its act together in collecting data about what works best, because there is precious little of that sort of activity going on as there are in all other modalities of the healthcare delivery system. It is a real problem.
A few years ago, the American Diabetes Association came out with a treatment guide for patients with diabetes. This gave private insurers and payers a guideline to set reimbursement rates. Many believe this type of guide is critical to improving the mental health care system.
Until that provider community gets its arms around what works, what doesn't, the same way that cardiologists have and the same way that gerontologists have and pediatricians have, this is going to continue to be a problem.
In Blumenthal's opinion, health insurers' bottom line compounds this problem.
Cost control and cost cutting have become a mantra in this industry. And perhaps there are good and sound ways to control costs, but not on the backs of young people who suffer from very severe illnesses or disorders.
I don't like the way I act and do things sometimes. I wish I could have gone to school and done a lot of things.
This letter from the Manson Youth Prison is the last one Diana Gonzalez received from her 17-year-old son David before he killed himself in his cell.
I love you. Bye. Right back. He kept saying right back.
David Burgos, lonely and distraught, sent to prison on charges he violated probation for possession of a BB gun.
I don't know if he was under medication. I still don't know.
Diana Gonzalez can't help but wonder, was her son's real crime mental illness?
Here's a kid that's got troubles, got mental illness, and they expected that kid to stay put in without running away? I'm saying, I don't understand that.
David's trouble started when he was in 2nd grade. The school complained he couldn't sit still and was easily distracted. Diagnosis, ADHD, attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder. Diana says she was in an abusive relationship around that time and had trouble taking care of David and his 3 siblings. Department of Children and Families stepped in and removed the 3 youngest. David was 10.
Because I thought he would be in a better, that he would get the help that he needed. Because I couldn't provide for everything that he needed.
Later came the bipolar disorder diagnosis, a 1.5 years spent at Riverview, Connecticut Psychiatric Hospital for Children, and then bouts at group homes.
David kept running away from them, running away, and it's like he said, they don't understand me, they don't know nothing, I don't like them. I mean, he was talking negative all the way. The last time I saw him that he kept running away was in March. And he came here and said, baby, you got a court date, you need to go to it.
Then came this letter in the mail, informing Diana her son was now in prison. How alone do you think you felt there?
How alone?
Alone.
To tell you the truth, so long that I couldn't even comprehend it. The most that I can take in to comprehending will be never compared to what he probably felt.
Along with photographs of David's happier days.
And these are the articles that I've been collecting.
Diana keeps a scrapbook about his death.
David was not a criminal. How many other kids in there are not criminals?
% of inmates in Connecticut's prisons have significant mental health needs, more than triple that when you talk about the state's juvenile justice system, statistics that follow the national trend.
It's probably the most significant challenge that faces people in the system right now.
William Carbone oversees all of Connecticut's court support services for the judicial branch. That includes juvenile probation and detention. He estimates about 70% of the kids that wind up in detention need mental health services.
You now have full-time nursing in all the detention centers because there are so many children who are on psychotropic medications. In all the detention centers, you now have weekly services of a psychiatrist available. You have daily, for 10, 12 hours per day, mental health clinicians in the centers that can work directly with children.
Connecticut started adding these resources in the late 90s after a federal court ordered the state to improve mental health services for kids in its juvenile justice system.
The mental health problem can be clearly identified as the source of the criminal behavior. So you can't simply respond to the crime that's been committed, because if you do that and don't respond to the mental health problem, you have a child that's going to keep coming back into the system.
If you have interest, we'll work on ways to get you into some of those programs. So
Activists Merva Jackson and Beresford Wilson are trying to do that one better, catch the kid with mental health problems before they get trapped in the system.
We started to see an overwhelming number of young people with mental health, learning disability, and other needs coming to our office, their parents saying, you know, my kid was just suspended or expelled from school and sent to juvenile court. And we were like, well, why?
This is what we're proposing, and I have some of the same concerns. But
after a few years of hard lobbying, their organization, called AFCAMP, received a state grant to start a juvenile review board in 2 of Hartford's neighborhoods. How does it work?
Well, I got in trouble in a school bus in a fight.
First-time offenders like Dalby Dupre who get in trouble at school or with police get referred to Merva Jackson through the courts.
They gave me like a psychiatrist or something. I don't know, like somebody I could talk to, like sort out my problems and all that.
Through our program, they can access mental health and counseling services at a quicker pace than they would be able to through other entities.
Like she helps me. Like,
it's not just about not getting a record and not ended up in juvenile, but it's also identifying what their needs are, whether it's academic, whether it's mental health, whether it's environmental.
Una rutina y le hacen cosas. They give him a routine to do that they don't want him on the streets. They give him stuff to do, keep him active from not being on the street.
The review board, a huge relief for Dalby's father, who was sure his son was headed to jail.
My dad was crying. Like, he felt sad. Like damn, my son gonna go get locked up.
Well, this is having that resource right there at the crisis point. Being preventative, interventive, and responsive.
In 2005, the first full year of its operation, the Hartford Juvenile Review Board diverted 250 kids from the court system. The cost, $100,000. The same amount it costs to keep one child in detention for a year. Saving money, saving lives. A critical safety net that was not available to David Burgos and many others like him.
You know, sometimes it takes a tragedy for you to realize it. You know, the things that maybe you could have done. I don't want nobody to feel the same pain.
There are real pockets of progress in the fight to improve children's mental health care. Connecticut and other states are looking beyond their borders for answers. 2 programs have gained a national reputation for leading the way, and they share the same philosophy that kids do best when they're treated close to home. Mary Jo Myers is one of the architects of Milwaukee's nationally renowned child welfare program, Wraparound Milwaukee, which has saved the state of Wisconsin millions of dollars in the 10 years it's been up and running.
We've taken the same amount of money that used to be just for kids in residential care, and we use that same amount of money to serve now 600 kids, where before you could only serve 350 or so.
She held a training session in Hartford for everyone from social workers to probation officers to parents. What just happened? Providing tools to keep kids with emotional and mental health problems out of jail and institutions.
And as soon as you start looking at strengths, it changes everything. People begin to have hope. They see that you believe in them. They look at their children differently.
Myers says the key is involving parents in their child's therapy.
So families come forward and feel like they can say what they need without someone taking their child away.
Connecticut's Court Support Services Division is adopting this strategy.
These are complex children, typically from complex families. And unless we address the larger family issues, that child is likely to keep coming back into the system.
Many times with disastrous results.
I could not bear managing the patients the way we were managing them. I thought it was a disgrace.
On the medical side, a similar philosophy at the Morgan Stanley Children's Hospital of New York Presbyterian, where Director of Psychiatry Dr. Jennifer Havens helped revamp and revolutionize emergency protocol for young psychiatric patients.
When you're building one of these units, you have to build it to inpatient psych standards, which is totally different than a medical ER. We had to cover this window. Obviously, you don't want a window in a psych unit.
Creating an emergency treatment center designed solely for kids in mental distress. Tucked away on one of the hospital's top floors.
The expanded design has a lot more space. Our ER is extraordinarily busy. It's very loud. It's very stimulating. It's very frightening. 50,000 patients a year, sometimes 100 patients an hour.
It's totally an unsafe environment for a patient who is in a position where they might hurt themselves. Who's that? 21 hours, is that true?
No. Dr. Meredith Sonnet runs the Children's Emergency Department at New York Presbyterian. Before the Child Psychiatric Emergency Program opened 2.5 years ago, she and Dr. Havens would often argue about how some of the young patients were treated in the ER.
In a busy emergency department environment, you're much more apt as a physician caring for a patient who's agitated or requiring psych intervention to use medications to calm them down, where that in fact may not be the best treatment for them.
That doesn't happen anymore. Now any child or adolescent presenting with psychiatric symptoms is transferred up to Dr. Havens and her staff. Last year, that was 1,100 kids diverted from the ER.
This has really, really just had a tremendously positive impact on our ability to take care of the kids and how we feel about ourselves as physicians and healthcare workers.
Dr. Havens has testified about her hospital's success before Connecticut's legislature, which is in the process of funding a similar center to address the crisis in the state's emergency rooms. Her innovative program, however, goes way beyond the hospital's doors. She's managed to treat patients in their communities, dropping hospital and residential admissions by 35%. And she's gone grassroots.
We're in 14 elementary schools providing service. We've put psychiatry and psychology in all the pediatric clinics we have out in the community. If you don't treat mental illness early, particularly when it disrupts school functioning, which it does, kids fail. And they become, disenfranchised, angry, depressed teenagers. We can't just sit and let these kids just go through life, struggling with this when we know what to do.
program brought to you by the generous support of the Connecticut Health Foundation, dedicated to improving the health of the people of Connecticut, Toyota Financial Services, the William Casper Graustein Memorial Fund, and Families United for Children's Mental Health. For more information or to purchase a copy of this program, please contact our website at www.danalis.com.